incluso, en fin, right? Las presentaciones están todas aquí, ¿no? La mía también.
Aquí, yo
bueno,
no.
Cargadas. Las presentaciones
sí.
están, ¿no?
Hay que... vale, ya está. Okay, buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por su atención. Gracias por venir. Let's start in English because of all the audience is in English. I'm so sorry for the delay, but we are waiting for our last speaker, so we are starting. And when Alejandra Kindeland could join us, it will be here in the table with us without any problem. So, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the chairman of Fundación ICO and myself, it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this ICO auditorium. It is a satisfaction as well to support Bruegel in the organization of this conference. We have no doubt that it will meet largely your expectations, given the highly specialized speakers invited and the long track record on this think tank in fostering talented and committed debate among first-line experts. Fundación ICO is member of Bruegel since 2014. From then on, we have gradually increased our cooperation not only by joining their debate and research program, but also by helping to put forward the current concerns of Europe's promotional banking as a strategic item of the agenda for policymaking. Today's Bruegel event, Inclusive Growth, Global and European Lessons for Spain, will deal with the outcome of globalized income generation patterns in terms of inequality, poverty, and social mobility trends in our societies. The program displayed will allow you to approach the topic as a gradual zoom of the map. First, Mr. Robert Lawrence, an Albert Williams professor at Harvard Kennedy School, will put growth in the global context, from his deep knowledge of international manufacturing and trade behavior and its impact in the United States employment and wages for the last decades. He will open a space for reflection on whether would it be convenient or not to change the paradigm of manufacturing as a reliable engine for inclusive growth. The report, An Anatomy of Inclusive Growth in Europe, written by Guntram Wolf and Solt Darvas, Senior Fellow of Bruegel, who joined us today to share his conclusions, provides a rich analysis of the factors to drive Europe through a less or a more inclusive growth model. Manufacturing, wage share, technology, financial deepening, financial globalization, etc. The study concludes in those key aspects that are solid enough to build a constructive framework for policymaking, to fight inequality, create employment, and boost social mobility in Europe. Then, Federico Steinberg, Senior Analyst of Elcano Royal Institute, will share with us a close look into Spain's inclusive growth prospects from the expert analysis of both socioeconomic and political recent developments in our country. To zoom even further, we will have Alejandra Kindeland, too, Head of Economic Research and Public Policy of Banco Santander. She will contribute to the debate with a focus on the corporate as a crucial agent to propel inclusive growth at the local, international, and global levels. It is also our honor to count on Maria Mertis, Deputy Director of Bruegel, an expert researcher who has contributed to policy input to both the European Commission and the Dutch Central Bank policy outlets. She will chair this session and moderate the time of the program devoted to questions to the speakers. I'm sure she will guide this morning work to the best outcome. Last but not least, I want to thank Bruegel and all the guest speakers for sharing their expertise with us in this house. It is a great opportunity for all of us. Thank you to the audience for coming, and now I shall give Maria the floor. Thank you very much, and good morning.
Thank you very much, Cristina, and thank you very much, Fundación ICO, for co-organizing this event. And also a very warm thank you to the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, without whose help we wouldn't be able to organize this. We have put together a program with very distinguished presenters, and I would like to immediately then pass on the floor to Bob Lawrence for the first presentation on manufacturing and the impact on inclusive growth. Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a privilege and pleasure for me to be here and to appear with all this distinguished panel. What I'm going to do is really focus on manufacturing. I've been working for the last 3 years trying to explain what's been happening to manufacturing. I'm going to briefly describe why I believe that manufacturing has historically played a role in helping achieve inclusive growth. But then I'm going to turn to the challenges that face the continuation of providing that inclusive growth via manufacturing, firstly in industrial economies and then in developing countries. The United States has had a rather traumatic experience. What I show you here is what's happened to manufacturing employment in the US since roughly 2000, well, actually since 1990. Over the 90s, employment was pretty constant. But what you can see is that since 2000, we have experienced the decline of almost 6 million. That's about a third of all jobs in manufacturing. And basically, this development is a continuation of a much longer trend. In this slide, what I show you in the blue is the share of employment in US manufacturing. And if you go back to the 1960s, what you can see is that something like 30% of all men had a job in manufacturing. A smaller share of women, about 24, but there has been this continuous decline in manufacturing's share in employment in the United States ever since the 1950s. And manufacturing was very important because it allowed men who had less than a college degree with a way to get jobs that provided them with decent wages, in a sense, to enter the middle class. It was also pivotal in certain parts of the US, particularly the Midwest, and in driving those economies. So going back to the 1970s, we can see an America which is very centered on manufacturing. The first manifestations of deindustrialization and its adverse consequences actually came in the ghettos. William Julius Wilson, my colleague at Harvard, wrote about the effect of deindustrialization in depriving black men of opportunities to work. But of course, what's happened is a narrative which has taken hold in the minds of many, including our current president and those who voted for him, in which this decline in manufacturing is fundamentally ascribed to America's trade performance. And what I show you here is the fact that our imports from developing countries of manufactured goods have overtaken, that's the pink line, have overtaken our imports from industrial economies. So there's no question that the US has experienced this process. And in particular, it's older white men who, and you can see here, remarkably mirroring the kind of vote in Brexit. In the United States, it were the same kind of people who have elected Donald Trump and who have extremely negative views on trade agreements, whereas the bulk of Americans still support trade agreements. This group, in effect, those who would have benefited from manufacturing employment, are most negative. Now, it has been a remarkably long-lived trend. I show you here the share of manufacturing employment going back to 1961. Suppose that in 1980, I'd said to you, listen, I want you to do a forecast. I want you to tell me how many people are going to be working in American manufacturing in 2010. I want you to go out 30 years out of sample. I'll tell you how many people are in the labor force. You tell me how many are working in manufacturing. What would you have done? Well, you would have fitted a trend line to the data you had up until 1980. And then you would have projected 30 years out of sample. And you would have been exactly right, within 25,000. So clearly, there is a very powerful trend at work here. Not simply, you wouldn't have known about China, you wouldn't have known about trade agreements, you wouldn't have known about globalization, or certainly as pronounced as it has been, but you would have been able to predict this. So what's going on? Well, part of the story everyone points to is technology. And basically, it's true that automation, technological change, has been particularly dynamic in the manufacturing sector. But that's only half the story. You see, what I show you here is productivity growth in manufacturing as compared with productivity growth in the rest of US GDP. And you can see, indeed, that we've had very rapid, relatively rapid productivity growth in manufacturing. Well, that is then reflected in prices. And this is a little confusing. I take the inverse of the prices, and what you can see is that other goods rise in price relative to manufactured goods, virtually 1 for 1. So, fast productivity growth, falling prices of manufactured goods, and then the key issue relates to what's never spoken about, which is demand. How do people respond to those declining prices? And it turns out, not very much. People say, gee, it's terrific. Goods have become cheaper. We'll buy a few more, but this now gives us more money to spend on services. So what's happened is, this is a logarithmic scale, the relative price of goods compared to services have fallen at 2% a year. The relative quantities have barely increased, and the result is the share of spending being devoted to goods is shrinking, and that's the blue line. There's a second force at work, which is that when people get richer, they tend to allocate more of their spending to services rather than goods. Poor people, they need to buy food, they need physical shelter, clothing, those are all goods. Rich people need psychiatrists, personal trainers, they need services. And so there's a second overlaid on this technology and rapid decline in prices is the fact with growing incomes, I've shown you the expenditures on goods by quintile, and you can see that the poorest people spend much more of their income than the richest, and all of them have these declining trends. So we go back to 1950, and Americans are spending 60% of their consumption on goods, and today they're spending around less than a third. So that's really a powerful trend in the background. I'll skip this. Now, it's not just the United States. Every major industrial economy has experienced a similar trend. If you look at Spain, you'll see that you go back to 1970s, and you had 24% of Spanish workers employed in manufacturing, today around 12. If you look at all of those industrial economies, Germany, minus 15 percentage points since 1973. In fact, virtually all of them around about 15 percentage points. So while we Americans like to see the world through our eyes and think it's only happening in our country and it's our trade agreements, this is clearly a pervasive phenomenon. And in all of the industrial countries, you also see that the share of spending on goods is falling, basically at around 0.4% per year. So what about trade? It's certainly true that trade has contributed to the loss of manufacturing employment. But if you go back to that 5.5 million, you'll conclude something like 1 million maybe due to trade, due to China's expansion and the dislocation it has caused, and you're left with more than 80% of the explanation being this combination of fast productivity growth and unresponsive demand. And by the way, I showed you how these declining trends are prevalent in the European countries and other countries. You'll see they were prevalent in Germany, which has an average manufacturing trade balance surplus of, relative to GDP of 7.6%, and it hasn't stopped them experiencing declines in the share of employment. Their level is higher, but the declines have taken place. Germany, Italy, Japan, 6.2% of GDP surplus, still declining trends. The reason is that basically the job content of that trade surplus is shrinking over time because of faster productivity growth. So unless you have an ever-growing trade surplus, unless it gets larger relative to your economy, you're inevitably going to see that the rapid productivity growth takes over. So I like to talk about this as being an escalator. The rapid productivity growth is the escalator, and you can walk up it. Take a few steps if you run a trade surplus. You can walk down it if you run a trade deficit, but inevitably, you know, there's a limit to the amount you can climb up the escalator. It's going to take over. We are going to experience declines in manufacturing employment. Now, let me briefly turn to developing countries. Actually, when you plot the share of manufacturing employment against income per capita, what you see is an inverted U shape. As countries begin to grow and develop, the share of manufacturing employment rises. Then it peaks, and later it declines. Why? Well, it turns out there are two forces that are at work, and they come fundamentally from what's going on in the agricultural sector of the economy. When there is rapid productivity growth in agriculture, just as with manufacturing, the aggregate demand is inelastic. There's a limit to the amount of food people can eat. So when goods get cheaper, people turn around and they buy other things. They buy manufactured goods and they buy services. So there's a powerful force coming out of agriculture which is creating jobs in manufacturing. That's a positive force. On the other side, we've already seen that when manufacturing has rapid productivity growth, there it loses jobs. So you've got a force creating jobs, agriculture shrinking and spilling into services and manufacturing losing jobs. And when economies have a large agricultural sector, the positive force dominates. Once they reach a peak, the negative force dominates. It's got to do with the shrinking share of agriculture. And so that's the hump. And you can see the green line is the share of agriculture in 19 countries. The blue is manufacturing, and the red is services. You know, we talk about the Industrial Revolution. Actually, that's a misnomer, because in fact, even during the period when Britain and all of our countries which are developed were industrializing, the employment in services was growing faster than employment in manufacturing. But eventually, in manufacturing, there's going to be this decline. there's a phenomenon which has become known as premature deindustrialization. It turns out that if you go back, maybe this is the simplest way to illustrate it. When manufacturing employment share peaked in 1953 in the United States, our real incomes were $17,000 in today's dollars. UK peaked at 32 in 1961 with 15,000. But the countries that are industrializing today are reaching that peak at much lower levels of income and at lower shares of employment. So take China. China is has reached its peak. And how many people are employed in China in manufacturing today? 19.2%. So around half of the peaks that were achieved by today's advanced economies. South Africa, 17% peak. Brazil, 15.4%, and at lower levels of income. So what explains this premature deindustrialization? To summarize it quickly, basically, technological diffusion has been much more rapid in manufacturing than it has been in services. So imagine that when you get to $5,000 per capita income, you want to ride a motorbike. That's your preferred mode of transportation. Well, when Britain and the US hit $5,000 in the 1950s, it took 10 people to make the motorbike. When India hits $5,000 today, it only takes 5. That's, in a nutshell, the story. Basically, technology is diffusing rapidly. One way it's doing that is it's embodied in machines. So that the machines they have available in India when they build bicycles today are much more advanced than the ones that were there before. And so what we find is that this premature deindustrialization phenomenon is inhibiting the ability of today's emerging economies to copy and emulate what happened in the advanced economies. I've given you a very quick overview. I'm happy to go into greater depth, but I don't want to hog the time. But basically, to summarize, in the advanced economies and in today's emerging economies, manufacturing is unlikely to play the same role in generating inclusive growth as it has done historically. Our politicians, our populations have not adjusted to this reality. They're still holding out hope that it's possible to bring back those jobs. What we have to do is to think about how we now achieve inclusive growth, but do it in other sectors of our economy. I'll be happy to engage and to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for sticking to the time. I have many questions that I'd like to ask, but I'd like to perhaps move on straight to the second and then collect questions at the end. So Zsolt Darvas, also from Bruegel, he will come a little bit closer to home and we'll talk about inclusive growth in Europe. Zsolt, you have also 20 minutes.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth for supporting this project and for ICO for the great cooperation for hosting this event. So, we have a nice report. I mean, at least nice blue from the outside, which is relatively long, and certainly it shouldn't be possible to present all of the ideas there in a 20-minute long presentation. So what I sought to do is to highlight 8 key messages, and I would like to deliver and explain a little bit and also illustrate those 8 points, which are all related to inclusive growth with a focus on Europe. Robert talked about took a much more global perspective. I will mostly focus on Europe. But first, just let me clarify our definitions, what we mean by inclusive growth. And so a very straightforward definition, which is provided by the OECD, is that it's a growth which creates both opportunities for all segments of the society and also a kind of fair distribution of the various kind of dividends, both monetary and non-monetary dividends across the society. And certainly, inclusive growth cannot be measured just one way. GDP is a very, very narrow measure. Job, skills, education, health, the environment, participation in the economy and society also matter a lot. And when we talk about inclusive growth and inequalities, which are certainly a center concept in this issue, then we also have to discriminate between inequality of opportunities and inequality of outcomes. In terms of opportunities, certainly the most important aspects are access to education, which is really, really crucial. There's a lot of research showing that, for example, for disadvantaged children born in disadvantaged families, early childhood education is really, really crucial for them to be able to raise to a higher social status than their parents had. Also opportunities for accessing jobs, finance, the judicial system, and also inequality of outcomes, which perhaps receives a bit more attention, such as income inequality or wealth. Now, following this introduction, let me highlight the 4 key issues I would like to talk about. The first, which will take probably most of my time, is discussing why does inclusive growth matter at all. Probably it's quite obvious that it's important. I mean, even the IMF has written many papers and recent reports emphasizing the possible drawbacks of various kind of inequalities. But I think it's useful to emphasize and mention a few key points, because this also help to identify the policies which might help to address the drawbacks of the lack of inclusiveness. The second issue is whether technological process drives inequality. I mean, Robert made a very convincing explanation. The technological process has a great role in manufacturing, production, and its share in the economy. I address a very much different question. And third and fourth, certainly since this is a study focusing on Europe, we will look at Europe in certain aspects and then ask what policies, both national and European policies, can foster inclusive growth. So I promised to deliver 8 key messages, and the first one is a controversial message, which says that if we look at the academic literature on whether various kind of inequalities, in particular income inequality, but also whether other inequalities are good or bad for growth, then the literature is really, really mixed. Some papers conclude that inequality is bad for growth. Other papers conclude that, in fact, inequality is good for growth. And also, certainly, there are also many other papers which conclude that there is no conclusion at all, in a sense that the results are not significant and depend on what model you use, what sample period, what kind of countries, and so on. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that, again, even though there are a lot of talks today about the possible side effects of income inequality, the academic literature is very much mixed on whether, in terms of long-term economic growth, it has an impact at all and what kind of impact. Now, I listed here a few factors which could both reduce and both increase growth related to inequalities. Certainly, reducing growth is related to investment in education. I mean, if there are wide inequalities and poorer segments of the society cannot invest in quality of education, then certainly it can lead to a lower level of human capital and a weaker economic growth ultimately. but we can also find reasons that why it could increase growth. I mean, if it encourages people to study more, because they realize that if they study more, they will earn more. That can certainly help the development of human capital. It can also incentivize people to take more risks. So there are a couple of mechanisms through which both could work. But let me come to the second key message. So even though I said that in terms of what's the impact of inequality on long-term growth is rather mixed, there's a growing consensus that inequality played a role in the unsustainable developments before the 2007-8 crisis, both in the United States and in European Union. Now, the standard argument says that the middle class and lower classes which faced a relative decline in their incomes were forced to borrow more and more in order to be able to maintain their living standards or keep up their living standards relative to the wealthier segments of the society. And it's certainly excess borrowing, we know that that's always a source of risk and can lead indeed to major crisis. Now, a lot of research has been done in the US. For Europe, I would like to just show you two charts, and I even highlighted Spain. So on the left panel, you can see the European Union countries, and on the horizontal axis, you can see the Gini coefficient of income inequality, and on the vertical axis, you can see what was the change in household borrowing. So the message is relatively clear that in more unequal countries, we also see that household borrowing expanded much faster than in more equal countries. And on the right panel, you can see on the horizontal what was the household borrowing before the crisis and what was the contraction in private consumption during the crisis. And again, you can see a very clear relationship that in countries where there was more borrowing by the households, there was a deeper contraction, and Spain very nicely fits the regression line. So I think that, a big question certainly is always causality, what is causing what. You can never exclude that there is a more fundamental underlying development, which, let's say, causes both income inequality and household borrowing. But at least the fact that we see this correlation suggests that inequality is certainly a factor which should be paid attention. And the next chart, which I think is really dramatic when I first saw this, is just show Spanish regions, so different Spanish regions, and shows in 2010 what is the Gini coefficient of income inequality within a region, and what is the youth unemployment rate. And again, here you can see a very, very clear and very, very strong correlation. Again, correlation is not causality, so you cannot say that, let's say in Andalusia, which has a relatively high Gini coefficient and high youth unemployment rate, whether indeed inequality is causing unemployment. But again, this very, very strong correlation suggests and demonstrates that income inequality is an indicator which has to be followed. The reasons behind increases in inequalities should be studied because certainly we can observe very adverse social developments also here in regions which are characterized by high inequalities. And in the previous slide, we showed that the same applies to countries. Now, the three message is that also explaining why income inequality is a very important indicator to monitor, is that it can be associated with less intergenerational or social mobility. Now, this is the research that we have not done, but we just borrowed it from another paper, which shows on the horizontal axis a very simple Gini coefficient. So what is income inequality? So if you move to the right, we can see more inequality. Now, in the vertical axis, you can see a kind of correlation, which is called generational earnings elasticity, which basically means how much does the income of, let's say, of a child when he grows up depends on the income of his or her parents. And when this correlation is high, then you can say that the children of rich people remain rich, and the children of poor people remain poor. And when this correlation is low, it means that the income of an adult doesn't really depend on what was the economic status of their parents. And you can either see, the US and UK on the right and on the top, while the Nordic countries on the bottom and the left, again, clearly highlighting that in countries when income inequality is lower, there's much more opportunities also for the lower segments of the society to progress. And again, I think it's a very important social policy to offer equal opportunities, or at least similar opportunities, to many different segments of the society. The fourth key message is that inequality might foster protest votes. We did a couple of estimations, both for the Brexit, the share of people who voted to leave, and also the share of people who voted for Donald Trump. I don't want to explain the regression, it's a bit more complicated, and we controlled for many factors like age, level of education, income, unemployment, race, share of immigrants, and also even in the UK, whether the voter was in London, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And what came out very, very clearly in both calculations is that indeed in regions when there was greater inequality, there were more support for Brexit and also more support for Donald Trump relative to a benchmark. How to interpret these results is certainly a question, but one possible interpretation indeed that some of these votes were protest votes against the status quo, against the elite. So again, high inequality can have also political implications. Now, the fifth key message is that technological development was not the main reason behind increasing income inequalities. And here I think, for the sake of time, I will not go through all the charts that I prepared. I just would like to explain shortly what are key arguments. So certainly when, with technological development, there is much more demand, so demand for skilled workers tend to increase. We also see both in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world that also the share of people with higher level of education is gradually increasing. And those who have, let's say, higher level education, certainly they expect and also receive a higher income. So if technology, drives the demand for these highly educated people, then it can also lead to increase in income inequalities. Now let me skip a couple of charts and show you this one, which also includes Spain. And let me start emphasizing the United States, which you can see just there. And so this shows how much wage per hour work changed from 1995 to 2009 at constant prices, which just deflated by the consumer prices. And for the US, you can see it very, very clearly that for the wages of high-skilled increased much faster than the wages of middle-skilled, and the wages of low-skilled increased very little. Something similar is you can also notice on China, which is on a different scale due to the really excessive wage growth there. You can see a little bit the same in Germany. But in fact, in many other countries, including France, in Spain is already highlighted, even in the UK, this is not really the case. Now, one could ask the question, whether this is due to the different structure of the economy or different supply and labor condition, supply and demand conditions. For example, here we have a chart which shows the average rate of unemployment of tertiary educated people on the horizontal axis, and also the change in this skill premium, how much more they earn relative to low-skilled people. And you can see that the US is really high on the top. So even though in the US the unemployment rate was relatively low, still the increase in the skill premium, so in the income of high-skilled worker was much higher than in a number of other countries. So something special is going on in the US. And again, let me skip a couple of charts. So and just come to this conclusion that clearly, technological change certainly tends to favor those with greater skills. But when we took a cross-country comparison, we find it hard to see whether it is indeed contributed to rising premium for the better educated and the consequent rise in inequalities. And we also conclude that many other factors could have played a role, like redistribution, which is really, really crucial, education policies, regulation, rent sinking, and certain other developments. Now, let me come to Europe, and key message 6 is that inequality and poverty in Europe are indeed rather low. So there are a lot of talks about inequalities and poverties in Europe, and certainly, I mean, we have to talk about that. There are certain segments of the society which really are in desperate situations, certain minorities like Roma and other minorities who find it very difficult to integrate and live from very low incomes. But overall, if you look at Europe in a global perspective, then we should be really proud that Europe is a much more fairer society, much more equal society. Poverty is much lower than in other parts of the world. A big problem is instead unemployment. And let me show you a few charts and table. Now, this chart compares Europe to the United States, and it shows the standard Gini coefficient of income inequality, both the so-called market inequality, which is before taxes and social transfers, which are the solid line, and the net inequality, which is after taxes and social transfers. And a bit of a novelty that we did here is that we measured the income distribution of the European Union as a whole, because what Eurostat does is just simply calculating a weighted average of the 28 member states, which, since the Gini coefficient is a highly nonlinear indicator, is not a correct methodology. So we derived the EU-wide distribution of income. And also, contrary to perhaps the perceptions, if you look at net income inequalities, then there was a sharp rise in the early 1990s, mostly because of the Central European countries that joined the EU at that time. They suffered major economic setbacks, and also people living there had a huge decline in their income relative to others. But since 94, 95, up to the crisis, there was a gradual trend and a robust trend of declining income inequality within the European Union as a whole, which I think is a development which has been not appreciated sufficiently. Now, the next chart puts Europe into a global perspective and shows a couple of indicators. I mean, poverty is an indicator of absolute poverty. What is the share of population living below $2 a day? And you can luckily see there's certainly non-zero numbers in Europe, so which is certainly a problem. But again, as I just said, we can be proud that the share of poor people is so low compared to other parts of the world. The next data column shows income inequality, which again diverse. I mean, relatively higher in the UK and Baltics and Southern European countries. But even these higher numbers are, these 35 values. I mean, if you compare to China or Latin America or Africa, clearly income inequality is much, much lower. Europe is diverse, I already said. This map shows income inequality after taxes and transfers in a map. But time is running, so let me come to my last two messages. The first one, I will just say it and don't elaborate it more because of time, is that if you look at what happened, let's say, in the past decade, we see a growing polarization, first between the south and north of Europe. We also see between young and old, and we also see the same between different educational groups, between well-educated and poorly educated. And this applies to practically all aspects of life. It applies to income. It applies to life expectancy. Poorer people live much shorter lives. They're much less healthy. It applies to unemployment. Poor and less educated people are found themselves much more likely in unemployment than richer and well-educated people. So I think this polarization within Europe and within different segments of society is really worrisome. And let me come to the last key message, is that national policies matter a lot for fostering social mobility and social fairness. while the EU can do very, very little. Now, I will not have time to elaborate, I'm afraid, all of the points that we plan to make. So let me just focus on maybe on the very last one, which is also illustrated by the chart, which shows the efficiency of the social redistribution system. So this chart shows two simple indicators. One on the horizontal axis is the social spending as a share of GDP. And on the vertical axis, you can see how much income inequality reduction is achieved through this social spending. And I mean, you can compare, let's say, Greece and Sweden, and you can see that in both Greece and Sweden, they spend about 18% of the GDP on social issues, on social assistance. Yet, you know, Greece achieves a much, much smaller reduction in income inequality than Sweden or Denmark. So this clearly suggests that the way the money is used is certainly much more efficient, much less efficient in Greece and much more efficient in Nordic countries. And you can also see here, I mean, this Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal are relatively in the same group. Also, Bulgaria and Romania is on the same group. But this has a very simple conclusion, which is highlighted at the bottom of the page. Maybe it's not visible from everywhere. So it just, without any extra money, Spain could achieve much better social outcomes by more efficient spending. So I think it's a very powerful message, and I think something which I would really advise policymakers to consider. So let me stop here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Zsolt, for this very comprehensive presentation, and also thank you very much for zooming in into the Spanish numbers, because I think our audience will really appreciate the story that is relevant to Spain. And in fact, we have two discussants next for 10 minutes each who are going to tell us more of the Spanish view on these issues. We start with Federico Steinberg from Elcano and Alejandra Kindlen then from Santander.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just... should come up here, or my presentation? Yeah, the presentation is over there. I just opened it, but it didn't come up.
Yeah, you need to press
okay, once
presentation.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to provide, well, thank you very much first for the invitation. Thank you to ICO, for Bruegel, for the organization of the event. I only have 10 minutes, actually, so I guess I will fly over my slides. Basically, I was asked to provide some, specifics about Spain. I really encourage you to read the full report, because actually I think there's a lot of deep thought in here, and I would just say maybe the EU can do a little bit more, but we can discuss that later. The reflection paper on social Europe by the Commission some time ago had some ideas there, even though I agree that we would need a political union and common labor market policies to really tackle the issue and other stuff, and we're not there yet. But let's see if we can move somehow to a fiscal union in the next years to be able to have more tools. But what we have in Spain, basically, and this is my main message, is that the Spanish economy has recovered quite strongly, and we all know that basically after a double deep recession and a really difficult situation in 2012, where the risk premium, as you can see there, was really skyrocketing. We had both external help with the whatever it takes and Mario Draghi's policies, and also the domestic reforms. And we can say we are, back growing a lot. Some people argue because we fall a lot, so we're growing a lot. It has not such a lot of merit. Other people argue, the Spanish growth model has somehow changed, and this is going to be more sustainable. We cannot really get into this at this point. Now, the problem is that the socio-economic impact of the very long and deep, double deep recession in Spain has been enormous. And basically, and this is on your data, but basically just to summarize, the main thing one sees that is astonishing about Spain is the very, very high level of unemployment. But also, I would argue that besides that, what we had is a very uneven recovery. Actually, that we had more people than we thought we would have left behind by this economic recovery, and this has had an effect on the increase in poverty and in inequality. Basically, social exclusion, particularly, there's an indicator that's very, very I think frustrating from a public policy perspective, which is children at risk of social exclusion has gone up more than on the average European country. Inequality has gone up much more than on the average European country. And, even in countries that experienced a similar crisis, we did, worse than them in terms of inequality. And I would argue that basically this has a lot to do first with the labor market regulation, but more importantly, with the way our welfare state operates. And just to, advance my key point, I think Spain has to rethink a little bit our welfare state. To summarize, in Spain, middle classes pay for the welfare state, middle classes receive most of the benefit of the welfare state, and also pensioners. But we don't have a lot of targeted tools in our welfare state for example, children, which the Nordics, for example, do have, basically because they've been more years in this business of having a welfare state and have much better targeted policies. But it's not an accident that inequality and extreme poverty have gone up so much in Spain vis-a-vis other countries. It's because our transfer systems were really not designed to address these particular groups in an environment of severe crisis and very high unemployment, right? So this would be my bottom line. So we need to give some thought about how we do this. Now, basically, I would argue that there are two structural problems in this transfer system, welfare state, if you want, and then I'll talk briefly about labor market, which would require another seminar, but that's another one. First is that I think we have a structural budget deficit, and this is unfortunate to say. Spain had, very big two imbalances when we got into the crisis. We really had no big problem in correcting the competitiveness imbalance, so we did the internal devaluation. It was hard, it was painful, but we did it, and I think we were quite successful in, recuperating, our unit labor cost dispersion vis-a-vis our trading partners. What we have not been able to do so successfully, and let's see if we can attain it in the next years, is to reduce the budget deficit. I mean, basically, we are growing at 3%, and we still have a 5% budget deficit, or we grew last year at 3%, and we still have this deficit. This is not something very, sustainable. Of course, we did a tax reform. We probably need another tax reform. We haven't discussed about that. But basically, here what you have is that public revenues collapsed with the crisis because we had a lot of revenues coming from the real estate sector. And, spending actually went up because of automatic stabilizers and other issues. So basically, we have to decide. I mean, we either raise taxes to maintain this level of spending, or we cut spending to reduce the budget deficit. But we cannot have both things. We cannot have our cake and eat it. I mean, this is really difficult. Denmark has a great welfare state, but fiscal pressure is much higher. The UK has more inequality, lower taxes, and a lower the public sector. This is up to the citizens to decide, but this is something we really have to confront. We cannot continue assuming we can live on with some issuing public debt and asking the ECB to buy it with the QE program. Now, this is a graph that you had. Actually, I took it from somewhere else. But the second problem is this effectiveness in our redistributive tools. Basically, we are in a situation in which, the way we spend public policy monies, transfers of all sorts, is not as effective as other countries in reducing inequality. So there's more to do here. And basically, you can see that in this index that I didn't want to use a lot of figures from your report. This is from the Bertelsmann Foundation, a German foundation that compares social justice in all the EU countries. We rank quite poorly, and basically, to summarize, we do very, very well in health. So health policies in Spain are state of the art, no problem. Intergenerational, I would discuss a little bit this result because our pension system is, is quite good. But here we're not, we're quite good compared. But where we don't do very well is in education, labor market access, and this whole thing of social cohesion and intergenerational mobility. So basically, to summarize and to keep to my 10 minutes, I would say that growth is needed, but it's not enough to have inclusive growth. We need to rethink how our welfare state spends, and this is a key thing that we have to dedicate to. I think in this moment where we are rethinking, tax deductions in a future fiscal reform, things like that, negative income taxes, these sort of ideas, and I think, and this is very debatable, but I really think we need another round of labor market reform, because something that is true is that the best way to actually bring people on board is to make sure they have jobs, and duality in the labor market, as you well know, is one of the problems of the Spanish economy, because as we all know, with the similar crisis to other countries, our employment level jumps 10 points more, and this is really painful. So thank you very much. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Federico, for very clear messages. And then before we open the floor, finally, Alejandra Quintelan from Banco Santander, also 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have slides. It's really a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation and for letting me join this very prestigious group of academics. I'm very impressed, and I have learned a lot from this morning's presentations. I'm sorry I was a bit late. I missed a couple of your slides, Professor Lawrence, and each of them include so much information and are so insightful that I missed a lot, I realize, so I'm sorry for that. I have been asked to give the corporate perspective in this discussion, which I think is going to be very important. And I just wanted to also add, before I start with that, a very small comment in one of your slides, Taras, which I thought were wonderful. The EU can do little, you said, no? And it's true that I understand that national reforms and national policies are key for redistribution, but I think that the EU, as Fede said, can do a lot in terms of integration, and I think that that's the way to go if we want to have more stable and sustainable growth. I think, we are living in times that in the financial markets, we don't see the significant differential spreads that we have seen in the past. We have made a lot of improvement in terms of our institutional framework and in terms of reducing risk and so on. But I believe there's still more to do. We have in the financial sector, banking union has been a key step forward, of course, with the SSM, SRM, a single rule book, etc. But we still need some risk-sharing mechanisms if we want to definitely break the sovereign bank link, and this is very important for everyone, for the economy as a whole, I would say. If we don't do this, then we will see that any shock to Europe coming from wherever it can come will make banks suffer, even if you are well diversified, if you are very strong, etc. Nationality still matters, and that's very unfortunate, I think. So that's a small point that I wanted to make on your presentation that we want Mike to discuss later. But let's go to the corporate perspective. So my first point, of course, is that the corporate sector is also suffering, is under a huge pressure in the current scenario that you have described so well, and we have huge challenges, of course. No, post-crisis growth in most countries is below trends. Technology is a challenge and an opportunity, of course, too. Consumers are changing a lot, and they are more demanding, they have more information, regulation is tougher, new competitors are emerging everywhere, business models are being disrupted by new technologies, so there's a lot on our plate also, no? And of course, I would add to that our reputation, and I'm talking the banking sector reputation, but also the large corporate reputation to an extent, I would say, is also damaged after the crisis and in this current situation. We are frequently seen as part of the problem. We don't hire enough, we don't pay enough, we don't lend enough. And we definitely want to be part of the solution, and we need to be part of the solution. So how can we do that? No? I would say that businesses in general have a huge interest in inclusion. Economic and social inclusion means better talent, better customers, better communities, better society, and better reputation too, by the way. So customers, shareholders, employees increasingly expect companies to contribute to communities as part of their core mission. Asset managers, and investment funds have policies that require companies they invest in to have programs in diversity and inclusion, for example. Employees, especially millennials in mature markets, are drawn to companies that make this part of their mission. There's a few data that I left on the table. I didn't add it here, but we have data from Nielsen research, for example, that shows that we have consumers who are willing to pay more for products that come from companies that are aligned with social, environmental, and ethical standards. And similarly, they are, rejecting. 44.5% of Spanish consumers, for example, have rejected products in the past from companies who are not aligned with these key principles. So, and you can define social, environmental, and in many different ways, I know, but that's I think interesting data. So it is clear that companies who don't have a social purpose will not be sustainable. And having a social purpose, in our mind, does not mean being an NGO. And this, we like the concept of profit for purpose in the bank, for example. And as an example, we have a purpose that we talk about all the time, which is to help people and businesses prosper, and this means inclusion. So this is just an example, and it's not just a sentence that we add to all our presentations and so on. It's the issues now that we are talking about when our top CEOs meet, for example, bank CEOs meet, and they talk a lot about culture and about mission and so on, things that we didn't maybe used to talk so much about in the past. So how does this materialize? Well, in our strategic plan, we don't, we just no longer measure progress in terms of profit and in terms of shareholder return. We also have added new equally weighted targets in our compass that is public, and you can see where it is, but targets that measure customer satisfaction and loyalty, that measure employee engagement, support for communities. So we have 4 quadrants: communities, employees, shareholders, and customers. And as I say, we measure all these indicators equally in our way to measure progress. And this is related to the way that we are compensated in the bank, and that we are establishing all our key business targets. So I think it is very important to understand that things have changed also culturally in corporates, such as in the corporate sector such as ours, and we really need to. We understand that the current situation demands new things from us, no? So more concretely, what can we do? Of course, we have to create jobs. That's our main, very important function. And also take a holistic view to employment. Pay is important, but we also need to support employees' health, family life, continuous training, other aspects that are important to keep the loyalty of our employees and the productivity of the company, by the way. We can support SMEs. We are actually supporting SMEs very importantly right now in the bank. We understand that this is the core of job creation in many of our countries. And when we talk about supporting SMEs, of course it's in our case by providing credit to them, but not only. We have had to add programs to help them go digital, to export, and to grow. We have a program called Santander Advance that combines all these aspects. And it's a challenge, because today it was easier for us to provide credit to companies that have tangible assets, but increasingly SMEs have intangible assets, and that's a challenge for the banking sector, of course. We also have to, we have to do our job well and be net contributors to the public purse. This is very obvious, but I think it's very important. And we also have to support communities, and this means recruiting from diverse backgrounds. It means tailoring programs for the weaker communities, supporting entrepreneurs, SMEs, and other actors. This is also part of our mission today. We have to make digitalization inclusive. Digitalization can be inclusive or exclusive, as it can promote inclusion or exclusion, as we've also seen. And it's up to us to make sure that digitalization is inclusive and or to soften its impact when it is not. Let me just give you a couple of examples here. Of course, access to financial services through mobile banking is an example of how to use digitalization to improve financial inclusion. But there's others, no? By lowering costs, digitalization also creates or improves access of businesses or people who would not have been able to afford financial services before. For example, you'll notice that banks can offer free commissions when you have, a certain level of deposit. Let's say 10,000 in your account. No, there's different commercial practices, but this reflects the bank's cost of maintaining such an account. No, if we are able to bring down this cost down through technology and digitalization, then we will be able to give commission-free banking to more people. So that's part of the efforts that we are all looking at, I think. So there's a lot that we can do and that we are doing at corporate level, but I think that it is key here to look also for public-private initiatives and combinations. We are working in similar fields, we are working with similar objectives, and we need, maybe combining efforts will be have a higher impact. Two examples of what we do in the bank. For example, we support education a lot, universities. We have invested more than 1.5 billion euros in supporting universities in the past 10 years. And an example of that is we provide 36,000 scholarships. We provided 36,000 scholarships in 2016. Many of them are to move, to provide students with opportunity to move to different countries, for example. We are also, shifting part of that support towards supporting entrepreneurship now also. And again, these are the same goals that, the public sector has: retrain, re-educate, reskill, and from the corporate sector we can and we are contributing to these objectives. Similarly, financial education is another field where we have been very active, and other banks, of course, where I think, again, public and private collaboration would be very beneficial. So in conclusion, we are concerned, we are also committed, and I speak from Santander, a big bank, but I think that I insist, this is something that we talk about when we sit together with other corporates and other banks. It's not unique. I just want to stress that there's a lot that we can do by helping businesses and people and businesses prosper, by financing individuals and SMEs, but we have to go further than that, contributing more to our communities and not just governments. Henry Ford has a very good quote I want to end with. He says, "A business that makes nothing but money is a poor business." So I think from a corporate perspective, we are perfectly aligned with the to-dos that we all have in this current environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. Very encouraging news coming from the corporate sector. The adaptability after the financial crisis, I think that's very useful for the banking sector in particular. So we have half an hour for questions, but before we do that, I'd like to ask Bob and Zold if you have any quick first reactions to the things you've heard, and then we can go to questions. You don't have to, but if there is something quick that you would want to react to, please.
Well, the one surprise I had was this finding that technological change hasn't been a major factor in income inequality. Now, it may be that in Europe, certainly when it comes to wages, they're less flexible, and so you have channeled some of these pressures into higher unemployment rates as opposed to income. But that doesn't mean to say, in a sense, it just says we may be looking at the wrong thing if we only look at wage inequality. My sense is certainly that we also didn't focus enough on what's happening at the very top, the top 1% of people. And I believe that technology is playing a huge role there in a sense, driving the economics of superstars, both in the corporates and actually I've been looking at sports and looking at how people, if you go back, if you took football, for instance, I know Spain is very dear, football is near and dear to your hearts. If you look at what the typical footballer earned compared to the average person, going back to the 1970s, I was looking at the British First Division Premier League. The average player would earn like 4 or 5 times what the average household earned. And today it's closer to 60 times. So there's just been a stunning change. And I believe it is very linked, obviously, to technology, to cable television, to the ability to reach huge audiences. And it's in a sense, it's a useful metaphor. So I think there's an argument, actually, where people have used the same economics of superstars to explain why CEOs, certainly in the United States and in several other countries, have earned such high wages. It all goes back to Alfred Marshall, who came up with this theory. There are certain activities in which the second best is a very poor substitute for the very best. Sport being the most prime example. And the thing about the best is it's fixed in supply. There can only be one best, or there is a best, and that's the house on the lake, or the one in the middle of the city. And then when demand increases, due to technology, due to the scope of the market, the very best walks off with huge rents. And I think that's happening in corporations. And I think it's also happening in other activities. And and that's sort of the rational explanation for the top 1% getting so much wealthier. There are other political institutional ones, but that would take me too long.
Yeah, maybe just a little bit on the top 1%. So it's also interesting that certainly in the US, the top 1% has a much higher share of the income than in Europe, and certainly it has to have some reasons. And another observation is that if you look at the sectoral composition of the top 1%, then in the US, I mean, certainly golf players and Mark Zuckerberg and the superstars are there, but we also see many professions, like, for example, doctors and lawyers, which are certainly also helped a lot by technology. I mean, also the medical development the technology is really huge. But still, some of these sectors could those sectors which enjoy a relatively high level of protection. If you look at Europe, in Europe we see much larger share of let's say manufacturing firms in the top 1%, where indeed technology can have a major role. So I don't deny that technology has an impact, especially on the top 1%. But what I would like to emphasize is that first, many European countries are very much different from the US, and redistribution can also play a very important role. I mean, the progressiveness of taxes, for example, declined a lot, and also may decline further in the US if the Donald Trump plans will go on. And also the protection of certain sectors and rent seeking can also play a major role. And there was also another issue which is by both Alejandro and Federico on whether the EU could do more or not. But maybe I would love to comment that. But I think let's now leave the floor to questions and comments, and then maybe we return to this issue later.
Thank you very much, Rolf. It's time to open up the floor. I know I have questions, but first let me be courteous and ask the audience if we can collect a couple of questions and address them to any of the speakers on our panel. The floor is yours. Yes, please, the gentleman here and then at the back. Is there a... Yes, please. There is a, if you could tell us who you are and where you come from, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'm Gonzalo Ramos. I'm I'm Secretary General of Public Interest Oversight Board here in Madrid. It's a question for Mr. Lawrence, Professor Lawrence. You made the point that manufacturing jobs have declined over the last 40 years. And you also said that those manufacturing jobs were providing jobs for the less educated people. So can you elaborate a little bit more instead of looking back? Can you look forward a bit? What options do we have to provide, if there's not going to be manufacturing jobs for less educated people, what options do we have? What jobs can we provide for less educated people looking forward if we want to achieve some sort of inclusive growth? I think that's a challenge that I could come out with after your very good presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back, yes.
Is it working? Yeah, okay. I have another question for Professor. Yes, my name is Fernando Gutiérrez. And I have another question for Professor Lawrence. He ended the presentation saying that for inclusive growth, you have to look for somewhere else than the manufacturing sector. Do you have something in mind? I mean, there is a role in public policy, in efficiency, level of efficiency of expenditure, is a role in trade or something else? Thank you very much.
If I may add actually to the first question on the manufacturing, can we extrapolate? You know, you did this thought experiment from the 1980s, and you said that if you will be bang on the prediction line. Can we continue this? And so for the next 30 years, if we were to do the same exercise, and can you then link that conversation to the conversation of whether this artificial intelligence is going to take away jobs away from us and actually cause that the culprit of that declining trend, or is this something structural? I mean, because we are talking about technology here. And then if I may add an extra question, that, I mean, Joel, we've talked about this before, but I think it's an important thing to discuss, and maybe I could address it to the rest of you as well. This issue of inequality and how much we should care about it. At the end of the day, I mean, the issue is really fairness more than inequality. If we have different skills, I personally don't have any problem with different remunerations for different skills, and that's unequal de facto, but it's fair. The question is, perhaps we should measure the degree of fairness of the way that the skills are distributed and enumerated rather than inequality per se, because there's a manifestation of fairness or unfairness, or is it? But of course then the question is, how do you measure fairness? And that would be an important point to address. But I think it goes much more fundamental to the things that really matter in terms of the inclusiveness. It's not just the inequalities, it's just the way that what we consider to be fair or we perceive to be fair. But let me return back to you, and then we'll take a second round. Bob, you want to go first?
Well, those are very difficult questions. The fact is that already our societies have adjusted actually to deindustrialization by and large. I mean, we're talking now, we've got 15% of the people left in manufacturing, somewhere between 10 and 15. So in a sense, what are the other jobs? They're the rest of the economy. They're the 85%. And there are a whole range of jobs. There are many, actually, trades which pay well. Plumbers, welders. There are skills that people can apply not only in manufacturing but elsewhere. It would take me too long to sort of list those kinds of occupations. But there is an issue, certainly in the United States and also in Europe, of where are the jobs located and where are the people located. And I think one of the issues that we've seen in our election was that we have people in semi-rural communities where plants and factories were very important and then closed down, and people not being as mobile as we used to think of them as in the United States. And so it's not even that there aren't the jobs, it's simply how do the people get to the jobs. And this is very tied in to our housing crisis, in which a lot of people found their houses underwater. They couldn't pay back the mortgage on their house, and so they were pinned down where they were located. So we had this immobility geographically, which exacerbated this their ability to adjust. There is a really strange phenomenon which I'm having trouble getting my head around, but I just want to draw your attention to it. On the one hand, we hear all of these stories about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, artificial intelligence, the pace of change having speeded up immeasurably. All the robots are taking over our world. That's one whole set of, and the cloud is revolutionizing information technology. And then there's the data. And what the data are telling us is we have incredibly slow productivity growth. And we don't see in the factories an acceleration in productivity. If anything, certainly in the US in the last 7 or 8 years, we've actually seen a slowing in manufacturing productivity growth. So it is a huge puzzle. I don't claim to know the answer. Some of the optimists say, well, these are so revolutionary that to fully exploit them, it's going to take reorganization of firms, it's going to take restructuring of workplaces, and this takes time. Certainly we saw that when computers were diffused in the 1980s, there was also not very rapid productivity growth. It took until the mid-90s before we saw the emergence of very substantial productivity. So it could be that, in a sense, the shoe is just waiting to drop. That's one interpretation. Another is that there's a huge exaggeration. By the way, there's also, even making the puzzle more difficult to understand, is the fact that if you look at the data, there's amazingly weak investment in equipment. That's partly why world trade slowed down. So how come if these robots give us such great potential, people aren't investing in them? Why is equipment expenditure so weak in the face of such revolutionary changes? So I am just pointing to some puzzles. I don't claim to have to know the answers, but it is certainly a difficult environment in which to understand what is taking place. Now, in principle, the displacement of labor has been going on for a very long time. We've been diffusing technology for a very long time, and in a sense, we know it's going to make us better off as a whole. And so the challenge then is how do we redistribute the benefits? It's sort of similar to international trade, it seems to me. If it is true that these are going to bear tremendous fruit, and we are going to be able to enjoy higher living standards, then one is to look at earnings, and maybe some people are going to get left out, and that's where I think government policy has to move. So it could be that we are going to face even greater challenges than we have so far if the projections of information technology, of the changes due to information technology turn out to be correct.
Thank you very much. And Zolt, any reactions?
Yeah, let me try to give some, not answers, but some thoughts on your question on inequality and fairness. And I would like to emphasize the different aspects of inequality. One is inequality of outcomes, let's say income inequality, and certainly the super talented earn a lot, and that can be fair in a sense. But I would like to focus more instead of the inequality of opportunities. So if, for example, if you look at the children, a child cannot select his or her father, and if the chances of a child depends on where he or she is born, I think that cannot be regarded fair. I mean, the progress of each individual should depend on how talented they are, how hardworking they are, how much effort they put into first learning and then working. And if, let's say, the schooling system is very much segregated in a sense that public schools offer a low quality education, while private schools, which can be only afforded by the rich, offer a much better quality of education, and therefore those children can progress much faster and to much higher level. Or the healthcare system, if the public healthcare system, has a low quality, and therefore those who rely on that spend more time in sickness and face other problems, live shorter lives, while again the rich can afford to pay for a much higher quality. So, or the judicial system, if it's so complicated and so expensive that poorer people will not have a chance to settle a dispute that they believe they have a right or an issue, and they cannot settle it because they simply don't have a prospect for going there. So I would like to emphasize the inequality of opportunities, which I think in any normative sense of the word fairness should say that yes, opportunities should be equalized. And this can have an implication also for the inequality of outcomes. In countries where outcomes are more unequal, also the opportunities used to be more unequal. So if you can look at France, for example. France redistributes a lot, taxes, labor, and all kind of a lot of taxes, distributes half of GDP. But at the same time, there's a good quality of public services, public schools, healthcare system are in practically fully public hands and offers, more or less equal even to poorer people. So I think that's a very important aspect.
Yes, please.
Linked to this, particularly this is a concept we are working in the Elcano in a report on the future of Europe we're preparing, is actually technological inequality, which is going to be one of the elements that that are going to determine some of the outcomes you mentioned. So in a way, this is where we think that the European Union, for instance, can also have something to say with the Digital Markets Union and some of the incentives that it provides from outside and the way it spends the little money it spends compared to other federal systems. This is somewhere where particularly southern countries, I think, are lagging behind in penetration of digital markets and access to technologies. And this is going to be a main element going into the future because of automatization, in the outcomes on inequality in the future. So maybe there, something from the Commission could come as, a sticks and carrots incentive structure that can help. And also just a small comment. My impression is that the Anglo-Saxon societies have a higher tolerance for inequality, maintaining fairness equal. So continental Europe, for some reason, and this comes out in the public opinion polls by the Pew Research Center and others, besides fairness, we all think fairness is important. We all think that, if you're a great doctor, you should earn more, or a football player. Well, I will debate that, but that's my own problem because I don't like soccer so much. But, basically, in the Anglo-Saxon world, in continental Europe, and Spain would be very much like France and Italy in that sense. The average person thinks that the state has to take care of big inequalities without thinking about why, but that's what they feel, right? So that's interesting. Yeah. In the US, the UK is a bit different.
Thank you for that, Alessandra. Any comments? Or?
Very small, very minor comment. But I think that in the public debate, when we talk about inequality, we are still focusing a lot on the outcomes. And I agree with you that I think, talking more about the opportunities it would be interesting in terms of how people understand and evaluate what's happening and what we can do. So I think that this broader concept is very important, that we talk about it and socialize it a lot in the public debate context.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have 3-4 minutes for a next round of questions. Please, gentleman here at the front. Can the mic, please?
Thank you. My name is Fernando Navarrete. I'm Director General here at ICO. And to all the panelists, I would like just, I think the most interesting element you brought into the debate is the distinction between fairness and inequality, but just focusing on inequality just for the sake of keeping the conversation restrict. I think we are too much concentrated on income inequality on a cross-sectional comparison. And even focusing on just income, not talking about wealth, which is a broader concept, we're still, because of it's easy to measure on cross-sectional comparisons. However, we completely forget about the life cycle component of income. So it's very different. In some societies, people earn basically the same throughout their life cycle. In other societies, you start learning less, but the earnings curve is much steeper. And this, just in a cross-sectional comparison, clearly shows very different results in countries, and both can be equally, from a fundamental point of view, absolutely equal. So all our measurements, they are easy, but they are completely distorted. And I think we should be paying much more attention to have much more refined measurements, even for inequality, even focusing on income inequality. I think we have very bad measurement approach in this respect. And I would like to know what is your perception on this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, one more question here.
Hello, Juan Delgado from Global Economics Group. Just one question on policies to address inequality or fairness. I get the impression that there is in the U.S. or in other countries, politicians are reviving kind of industrial trade policy in order to address inequality issues, while on the other hand, focused on more labor, social, or education policies. Is there any role, for industrial policy in this new world to address inequality, or we should focus on more traditional long-term measures like education, labor markets, or social policies? Thank you.
If there's no other, is there any other question? One last question, and then we'll return to the panel. If not, then let's use the last 5 minutes to respond. Zolf, would you like to go first? Because given I think that the questions are more for somebody who has really worked with measurements of inequality.
No, but let me start with one question on industrial policies. It depends on what you mean by industrial policies. I think Professor Lawrence demonstrated very clearly that if industrial policy means supporting traditional manufacturing, that will not work. You may have results for a few years, perhaps, at best, but that will not work. So the question, what you mean by industrial policies, in Europe, in principle, industrial policies are prohibited. But certainly what countries do, and I think they should do, is to select some certain industries, which, under industries, it can be services or even in some cases some agricultural sectors, which they believe they have some kind of comparative or any kind of advantage, and try to support the development of those, or if they believe that the country has a good capacity for research and development, then certainly more research funding could be helpful. While if a country is at a very low level of development and has no real prospect for contributing to the development of technologies, then spending more on R&D would not be really helpful. In those cases, maybe support for SMEs would be more preferable. So again, a lot depends on what you mean by industrial policies. But I do believe that these more traditional labor, social education policies have really, really crucial roles, and we can learn a lot from, let's say, Scandinavian countries, what they achieved and how they achieved it. Now, on the measurement of inequality, and that depends on the life cycle. That's certainly true. But I think the big question, whether there is a structural change within the society, because if let's say in some countries, in Anglo-Saxon countries, people become richer much faster than, let's say, in Germany or France. But this structure is the same through, through generations. Then I think it should not have a major impact on possible cross-country comparisons. I mean, having said that, I very much agree with you that just focusing on one indicator, the Gini coefficient after taxes and social redistribution, social transfers, is a too narrow approach on many other aspects. Different quantile ratios, top 1%, bottom 5%, bottom 10%, and so on. And in fact, what would be perhaps even more important than inequality, in my view, is focusing on the poor people. Because again, whether inequality is good or bad, whether we should address it, that's an issue. But certainly helping the poorer segments of the more disadvantaged segments of the society, I think that can be a kind of social policy goal on which I think a broader consensus could be reached.
Thank you, Charles. Bob, any final thoughts?
Well, those are sentiments, helping poor people are sentiments with which I agree, but I do believe that inclusion has to mean including everybody. And what we have experienced in the United States is, in fact, the consequence of not including everyone. And by and large, the people who have voted for Donald Trump are not poor. It's very important to appreciate that. They are people who, and it isn't even only in their life cycle, but the life cycle of their children, who see a lack of opportunity. And so by not being able, there is no question that their opportunities have diminished, and they feel excluded. And actually, when they hear people talk about programs to help poor people, they don't think they're talking about programs to help them. They think it's someone else who's going to get the help, and they're really angry about not, in a sense, being heard. So there is this perverse effect that, just to tell you, President Obama made a speech on inequality a few months before his State of the Union address. This was 2 years ago. And he said it was the issue of our age. And what he heard back from his political people was that he should not be talking about this because it's going to backfire. And he then gave a State of the Union address in which he barely mentioned it. So I just want to mention then that inequality has a different meaning to people who think it's other people getting help. And so we need to have inclusive growth in a much broader sense, it seems to me. And we need to focus not only on how we help the very poor, but actually how we help those who've lost hope when it comes to opportunities. And that takes me to the question. I don't think the answer lies in industrial policies, but I do think the answer lies in more sustained economic growth. You know, if you look at the median household and you ask, well, how much richer would they have been if we hadn't had this increase in inequality? The answers you get is they would have been a third richer, but they would have been much, much richer if we'd have been able to sustain the same productivity improvements after 1973 as we did before. In other words, it's slow growth which is causing a lot of these pressures combined with inequality. And I think, therefore, we definitely need policies. I wouldn't call them industrial, but ones that encourage more investment, encourage more research, encourage more education, because those are the things we think contribute to economic growth.
Thank you very much for that. Any final thoughts from Alejandra or Federico? No? Okay, now then, thank you very much for very thoughtful discussions on very important issues. And with that, let me thank again Fundación ICO and the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth for helping us make this possible. Please join me in thanking the panelists for very interesting discussions. Thank you.